Hi, my name is Jeff Harlig. I'm the director of the Cal State San Marcos Writing Center. What you're about to see is one of a series of videos on writing prepared with San Marcos faculty. In this series, you'll hear faculty from several departments on campus talking about the whole range of the writing process. In my years as a teacher and counselor, it's become clear to me that when students get a writing assignment, they often don't really know what's expected of them. They may not know why they're writing, and they may not know what the finished product is supposed to be like. For that reason, I decided to talk directly to faculty and ask them questions like these. Why do you ask students to write? What are your expectations for writing, especially as regards the conventions of your own field? And finally, what's the role of writing in your own life and work? Our hope is that some of the mystery of the writing process can be cleared up by hearing answers to questions like these from the people who know best. Let's listen in now.
It's hard to, it's difficult to say exactly what I'm looking for in a writing task because each writing task is different. So I guess one of the things that I'm looking for in terms of college level writing is that instead of looking for like a magic formula or some specific equation that's going to always equal perfect writing, what I want students to understand is that there is no such magical formula or perfect equation because each writing task, each assignment is a negotiation between the task, what's being asked of you, between the audience, what their expectations are, between the writer, what the writer wants, what you want or need out of the task or assignment, and what's and the content, and what's being communicated, and you're constantly negotiating those things. So in that sense, writing itself mimics the process of critical thinking because you're not it won't be the same every single time. You have to think constantly about all of those factors and negotiate them as you write. So for me, writing is like critical thinking, and it's a way to demonstrate critical thinking. So for that reason, I guess one of the things that I'm expecting or hoping from students is that students use writing as a way to show how they're thinking and to help them develop their thinking and to help them grow. And to help students think about writing as a way to grow and to develop and hone their ideas rather than maybe just as a means to an end always, and the end being a grade. I know the grade is important, but so is learning, and writing is an important way to help you learn. I'm looking for them to see writing as something that they use for themselves and that they don't just do for other people or for other for assignments or because their teacher has asked them to do, but that they themselves see writing as useful in their lives and as something that can help them figure things out, or if they're from everything from sort of personal to professional, they're going to have to use writing professionally. I'm hoping that they are also wanting to use writing in personal ways as well. And that the range of what they can use writing for gets expanded a little bit, maybe besides just to get an A or to do this task that my teacher has set out for me. So yeah, I guess I want them, to see the benefit of writing for themselves, not just to see the benefit of writing, through in their classes, I guess. Yeah, I think that the students at our university come to us with a lot of different skill levels, and I think that novice writers do tend to rely more on sort of formulaic responses to things rather than trying to think more carefully about the relationship between the content that they're trying to get across and the form that they're being asked to get it across in. Those things are connected. But I think it's hard to ask someone to think about these broader concerns and to make these complex negotiations when they're still working on sentence level issues, like when they're still struggling with how to write sentences that adhere to the conventions of standard English grammar that they're being asked to do in their classes. And it's hard to get someone to I feel like there have to be steps, right? You have to help students start where students are and step them slowly into a place where they feel comfortable enough with their writing that they can maybe move beyond the idea of the rules, which are important. I mean, we have them, they exist, but they're all relational in grammar and they're all relational in writing as well. when I'm teaching argument-driven writing, we start by looking at what is an argument, right? What constitutes a good argument? What's the difference between a topic and an argument, or something that makes a claim about that topic? And we practice, doing that. Then we look at sort of sentence level issues. Then we look at paragraph level issues, and then we look at issues that go through the whole paper. And I really think that part of what helps students and other people that are writing negotiate all of that is the process of feedback. What your English teachers will call revision. And I know it's a lot of times when we think of writing in these task-oriented ways, revision is anathema, because we're like, well, I did it. I did the thing. I finished it. Why do I have to go back and do it again? And I think some of that that attitude towards revision comes out of viewing writing as something that just accomplishes a particular task and isn't necessarily connected to your intellectual growth. Because in the, this real world place that supposedly exists outside of academia, one does have to write in collaboration and in response and engagement with other people. Whether those people are your employers, or whether those people are people that you're submitting things to that you're interested in getting published, or whether those people are the people that work with you on your team. You're sort of constantly being asked to rethink the way that you present yourself and your material. So I think that for novice writers in particular, that feedback loop is really important, because it helps them understand places where, okay, here maybe the audience isn't with you, and at least me as an audience member, I'm not with you, and I understand that for you, you're here, but I'm over here, and how can we get to this place? And I feel like revision and feedback and that loop that you can do with students and peers in places like writing centers and language learning labs, and places like in-class workshops, those are really important places, especially for new writers, because it's hard to negotiate all those things. So in the humanities, and in particular in the humanities and in writing about literature, what we're doing is we're making arguments about texts. And if you think about in the sciences, they interpret data. In the humanities, we also interpret data, but the data are texts, right? It's in the literature or in history, it's the documents. And our job is to make claims about those documents, claims about the texts, and then to support the claims with evidence. And that's regardless of what kind of text you're working with, whether it's a literary text or nonfiction or whatever it is, you work with the evidence provided there, and you make interpretive claims, and that's your argument. So this is the kind of argument-driven writing we do in the humanities. And what I found is that students often struggle with this kind of writing because in the past they've been asked to do writing that is more reporting on what other people have said, and that's less concerned with them making their own original claims. So I've developed this, I don't want to call it a formula, but I've developed a model that I think can be helpful. It's not a formula in the sense that if you follow it religiously, you'll automatically come out with a product. But what it is a way to help people think about, what are you doing in a paragraph? What is a paragraph for? What is the point of a paragraph? And why do we, for example, draw on secondary sources? Why do we bring in other people's ideas? What's that about in argumentative writing? So the model that I use is called the pie model, P-I-E, pie. And I say, you have to give your reader the full pie, not just a piece of it, but the whole thing. That's what the reader needs. And pie it stands for point, illustration, and explanation. And this is what, I argue needs to be done in every paragraph on some level, or you can even think about it as every section of a longer piece, but certainly each paragraph or each section needs to have these elements. You need to have a point. You need to understand what you're trying to tell us in the paragraph. And a paragraph is designed to be a sort of unit that tells you one thing. Here's the one thing of this paragraph. And so oftentimes I'll see, for example, a paragraph that starts, a student has started the paragraph with, according to John Smith, the world is flat, or whatever, the student is writing about. And for me, this is evidence that the student maybe doesn't know exactly what point they are trying to make. Instead, they're allowing this other person to make a point for them. and that's a signal in a sense to me that maybe they're not entirely sure what their point is, or maybe it emerges later in the paragraph, or maybe they're not really in control of their argument. Instead, they're kind of reporting back what other people have had to say. So, having students actually diagram what is your point in the paragraph, where's the sentence that tells us what the point is helpful to students. And I actually had a student come up to me one day and go, "There's no P in any of my paragraphs. No P." And I went, "Yeah, you got to put the P in." He's like, "Yeah, now I know. There needs to be a point." And it was exciting because in a sense it's a way to diagnose, like, am I saying these things? So when we make points, then we have to illustrate them. And illustrations happen differently in different disciplines. In the humanities, as illustrations are most commonly quotes and or references to things that happened in the text. And that's the illustration. So whenever you make a point, if you make a claim about a character, if you make a claim about how to interpret a part of a text, you need to then demonstrate how you got to that claim. So you need to illustrate it. Outside the humanities, you might illustrate it with data or other secondary sources, or you might illustrate your claim with secondary sources in the humanities. And those things actually, oftentimes students can do the point and the illustration, and it's the explanation, that can sometimes be the most difficult thing. Because to a writer, to me, it's obvious how my illustration proves my point, but it's not always obvious to a reader. So you need the E, which is the explanation of how does this illustration actually prove the point that you're trying to prove. And you can never assume that it's obvious to the reader. It's obvious, to the writer, and the explanation is, in a sense, the hardest part of the paragraph. It's the part where you're really revealing your logic to the reader and taking them through and showing them, this is how this data gets me to this place, this interpretive place that I've reached. So I find the pie model to be useful, especially for new students, to think about just what am I doing in each paragraph and why is it there? What's happening with it? Although I don't think you should slavishly adhere to that. Yeah, with the writing process in particular, I definitely take them through step by step. And in my writing workshop, they start with an argument, which they workshop, then they workshop a paragraph, then they workshop a few pages, then they workshop the whole thing. We really, really work on every single step. And another thing that I do in the classroom to help students understand is we'll do some writing in the classroom, and then I'll put those examples up on the screen, and we'll talk about what works here, what doesn't work, how can we get this to the place that we want it to be. Then I'll show another example that's maybe more successful. Now here's why this one works better. I do this in particular with something called close reading that we do in the humanities. And it's in the pie model, the close reading is the explanation part. It's the part where we explain how does this passage from a literary text actually show whatever it is I've claimed that passage shows. If I say Macbeth is written by guilt, and I give you a quote, then I need to explain how does that quote show that Macbeth is written by guilt? What about that language implies guilt to you? And this is close reading that we do in our discipline. And with the pie model in particular, I like to help students think about how their paragraph should look by giving them a visual image in color. So I'll put a sample paragraph up, and the point will be in yellow, and the illustration will be in green, and the explanation will be in blue. And then students can see what that looks like, that there should be a yellow part, and the yellow part should come early on so that we know what the point is. And there should be green in there, but it shouldn't be all green. It shouldn't be everything that everyone else has said and nothing of your own. There should be mostly actually explanation, mostly blue, because that's you, that's the student's ideas coming through, and that's what I'm interested in. That's what's important. I could read all these other people's writing myself, but what I want to know is how does the student synthesize them? How does the student think this illustration, this piece of evidence actually proves the point that they want it to make? That's what's important. So it should be mostly blue, the paragraph. And I think that's useful because when students can apply that to their own work and look and see which part is the P, which part is the I, which part is, oh, there's no E. Oh no, I need to put some E in. And it also provides a nice shorthand for me when I'm looking at their papers and commenting on them, because I can go, oh, more explanation here. Oh, what's your point in this paragraph? And then they know what I'm talking about, and that can be helpful to them too, to actually, oh, that's what she means when she says do this or that, rather than sort of a random comment that they don't really understand. I started teaching grammar in one of my writing workshops, like straight up grammar, because I found that in conferencing with students, I didn't have a language to talk to them about things that they were patterns that I saw in their writing, where they were not using conventions of standard English. And the conventions of standard English aren't the most important thing on the planet, but they are things that employers expect and that reflect, people see them as reflecting intelligence. Whether that's true or not, that is a way in which they're perceived. If you master these conventions, people perceive you in this way, and if you haven't, they may perceive you in other ways. And that may not be right, but that's what happens. So I didn't have a language to talk to my students about that, so I started having to just teach grammar in order to talk with them about their writing. And no one really loves to learn grammar, but they found it really helpful actually in the end, because it gives us a language to talk about why doesn't this sentence work? Why is this sentence not clear exactly? What is it about it? And I think they find that helpful. I hope they do. People will say, like with this example of Macbeth, where it's not really an argument to say that he feels guilty, but it's a claim. It's an interpretive claim about his character, right? So he feels guilty. I don't know what that's in service of on some level, but okay. He feels guilty, and maybe they quote him saying something like, saying like right after Macbeth kills Duncan, sorry, spoiler alert, he kills the king. Right after he kills the king, he says, why could I not say amen? The word caught in my throat. I couldn't say it. I couldn't say amen. So a student might say Macbeth feels guilty. He says he couldn't say amen, and then say, this shows that he is guilty. Okay, well, you're saying that it does, but what is it about him, the amen catching in his throat, that makes him seem guilty? What I would hope a student would say would be something like, the fact that he can't say, quote, the fact that he cannot say amen shows that on some level he doesn't feel like he's worthy to say it, or implies that there is something holding him back from saying it. I interpret that as guilt that holds him back from saying that. That kind of thing. So they're explaining, what is it about the actual evidence that makes you think it shows guilt? Not just saying it shows guilt, but explaining what about it. What is it about the connotation of the language, or the way the metaphor is put together, or whatever piece of the language, how does the language actually create whatever effect it, that you say it creates? And that's the heart of close reading. That's what close reading is how, show me. Read it to me so that I understand it in the way that you understand it. And then I will be convinced, because I'll be reading it in a sense as you're reading it. And that's what I want. That's what a close reading or an explication is. As long as they've explained it to me successfully, great. I mean, persuasion is quite subjective in terms of what we find convincing or not convincing. But the point is to reveal the logic, right? To reveal the thought process behind it. And I guess that maybe answers an earlier question of what does writing look like that's thoughtful, and that where we see the thought process being developed. Well, that would be an example of, when you actually narrate for me the logic process that you go through in interpreting, versus just making a claim, asserting it's true, and leaving it at that. Boom. This shows this. Boom. You're done. Well, what if to me it doesn't show that? Explain to me how it shows that to you. I often share my writing process with my students, because I do feel like there are a lot of myths, or at least a lot of mystery, about how good writing happens. And I think that for me, one of the conceptions that I hear students saying to me that they think about writing is that for good writers, writing's easy. That on some level, good writers just have writing pour out of them onto the page, and that that it's easy ultimately. So one of the reasons I like to share with them my writing process is that I don't think that writing's ever easy for anybody. I mean, maybe it is for a few people. I don't want to, I guess, make too many claims, but I think that writing is difficult. It's that simple. Writing's hard. Even good writers, writing's hard, and it is also a discipline. And so, so I think that it's important for students to understand that just because writing is hard doesn't mean that you're bad at it, or that you're not doing a good job, or that you can't ever produce good writing. But that it's going to be a struggle sometimes. For me, in order to get writing done, I rarely ever am in a state where there is just writing pouring out of me in some sort of wonderful, rapturous, organic way. In fact, usually it's more me sitting at the computer for a scheduled amount of time, hoping to create some kind of Pavlovian writing response where if I, at this time every day, sit in front of the computer, then I will train myself that that's the time when one writes. And I know something about myself. I know that in the mornings I'm much more creative, my mind is much more focused, and I'm a much better writer if I work in the morning than if I work at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. And I found that, for me, writing there can be parts of it that go really well and that do feel like you're saying something and you kind of work your way into a place where you're like, yeah, I'm saying some good stuff. But it can also be a lot of staring at the screen, a lot of typing a sentence and then deleting it and then typing it again and then deleting it and then typing it again. It's a lot of hard work. And for me, in order to get long writing tasks done, like the kind that, academics have to do, like writing books or writing really long pieces, I have to schedule myself lots of short little writing sessions. If I expect myself to sit down for 6 hours and produce some beautiful draft, I'm usually disappointed with myself because I can't. It's hard for me to sustain 6 hours of intense writing. So I feel like maybe sharing that with students will help them understand that it's normal to struggle. It's okay. That's part of the process. It doesn't mean you're a bad writer, and that So I think that understanding that it is hard and it does take discipline, and that's it's just like exercising for a sport. If you stop doing your exercise for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then you go back to do your exercise and you can't do it. You're not as good. It hurts. You can't stretch as well or run as far or do whatever. And it's the same thing with writing. If you just haven't been practicing and then you expect to run a marathon or write a 20-page paper in one night, it may not work out as well for you. But you can get there and you can do it. That's part of one of my jobs as a teacher. When I teach, when I have students do writing tasks, I often have them do it in steps where they do some sort of proposal or initial thought about it, then they do some sort of something else, some piece of it, then they do another piece, so that I'm in a sense forcing them, or at least showing them, modeling for them that writing works best when you work on it over a time period and when you come back to it and keep thinking about it. I like to think of this idea that I have my students do proposals if they're doing like a writing project of some kind, and the proposal's often very loose, but the idea is just to get their mind on it, because I really do believe, and this maybe sounds hokey, but that your mind really works on it, and in the subconscious and in the unconscious places it sort of percolates back there, even if you're not thinking about it consciously, so that if you've spent some time thinking about it, then you're going to be working on it, and then when you come back to it again, you'll have other ideas, and your brain will have been working on it even though you maybe weren't consciously focused on it. Because I do think a lot of writing comes from, it's a mixture between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, which is why it can be art, I guess, as well. I think that everybody has a different writing process. I know there's someone in my department who says that they do write in this long, sort of like 12-hour stints of writing, and I don't disbelieve that person. I'm sure they do. For me, it doesn't work that way. So I also try to encourage students to remember that it's different for different people and that you need to know yourself. If you're the kind of person who, needs to have your desk very neat before you start doing a writing, that's okay. That's part of sort of the writing process for you, organizing that. If that's what you need to do before you sit down, then that's what you should do. If it calms you and gets you into the writing, oftentimes I will free write a little bit before I start, just what am I thinking about right now, and ask myself questions. I often have to have a cup of coffee. It's my little ritual, and these things are okay, and that they're different for everybody, and people do compose in different ways, and that's okay. That's normal. Your process may not look like your neighbor's process, but your neighbor's process may have something useful for you. So maybe you should hear about their process and check it out, because maybe they're doing something that would be really cool for you, but that you've never tried before. And that's something I try to do in my writing workshops, is just this idea that, let's share our ideas and our techniques, because something works for me, or it may work for this writing project, but not for a different task. It may be that for this project, I need this process, and for a different project, I need to work in a different way because the needs of the project are different. So I think that's important for students to understand as well. Well, I did when I was working on my tenure file. I felt a lot of fear associated with that, and that was actually an interesting story. I don't know if students will find it interesting or not, but so I don't know if you know this, but faculty have to apply for tenure, which means they're going to keep us on. They're not going to fire us. And this is a very stress-filled writing task, applying for this. It's 15 pages plus, a bunch of other stuff. And when I first sat down to write it, I was paralyzed because there was so much writing on the writing task. And I also couldn't kind of imagine how I would do it all. It seemed overwhelming. It was this large thing. And so I just had to kind of sit down and start just writing some stuff, just like, okay, what do I want to say? And then I shared it with someone, and that someone, asked me some really hard questions. It was like, you sound defensive, and why, and blah, and I had to go back and sort of rethink it, and I had to, stick a little message to myself. I do this, I tell my students to do this too. Sometimes so I stuck a little message to myself up on top of my computer that I was supposed to keep in mind the whole time I was writing. And I often do that with like my argument. I'll stick it up, I'll write it out on a piece of paper or type it out and stick it on the top of my computer so that it's always there for me to look at. I recommend students do that too sometimes, because that helps when students get off track or like start talking about things that aren't related. And I'll say, look back at your argument. What are you talking about? Does it relate back? How does it relate back? If not, get rid of it, or explain how it relates. So I did this with a message to myself for my tenure file of like, don't be defensive, essentially. It's a similar kind of message. It was like, you're great and they should be glad to have you. That was actually what I wrote. And I kept reading that, and it changed the way I wrote my file. And then when I brought it back and showed it to the person who had read it the first time, and they looked at it again, they're like, this is so much better and so much different, and it was really great. But I was paralyzed with fear at first, and I had to get feedback to help me, and I had to, just jump in and start and give myself plenty of time. And I got tenure, so it worked out. Well, and one of the first things you should do if you haven't already is talk to your professor. I mean, most of us are not horrible ogres. Like, we actually want to help you. And come, if you're like, I don't really understand what you want me to do. I would love if a student came and asked me that question and said, what do you want? I don't really understand this writing prompt. Can you explain? Can you help me understand it? Of course I can. Now, you can't do that like the 2 seconds before it's due. You have to come like at a reasonable time, before. But I think that, if you're unsure about something, talking to your professor is a good idea. Or talking to someone else who's taking the class, or talking to a friend who you can express some of the fear, and that might help you manage it a little bit. But yeah, writing can definitely be a stressful, fear-oriented activity. It doesn't have to be, hopefully, in the best of circumstances. In the humanities, at least in the way that I talk about it with some of my students and my graduate students in terms of using secondary sources, a lot of the secondary sources in literature are other people who are making interpretations of the same, of texts, of whatever the stories or poems or whatever you happen to be analyzing. And these folks then, we use those kinds of secondary sources in argument-driven literary analysis to help clarify or distinguish our own ideas. So I tell students, I have a little sort of sheet that I hand out that says there are two things that you use secondary sources for. One, to provide alternate interpretations that you're going to engage in some way, or to provide outside information that's not available in the text, but that will help elucidate something in the text. So for example, if I want to say that a 14th century, I'm a medievalist, so a 14th century text reflects the change that happened because of all the crises that happened in the 14th century, and that there was a change in society as a result of that, and we see that in this piece of literature. I'm going to probably need to show what all those crises were and what the changes was, and I don't know that information just from my own top of my head. I know, well, I do, but a student might not. They have to go to sources, right? And so one thing that you use sources for is to provide information that's relevant to the text. So if I'm going to say that this text reflects this change, I need to document the change, and I use a secondary source to do that. And the point of doing that is to show the change in the literature. So my argument is still central, and I use the secondary source to help provide the information. Literary analysis, one of the other reasons that you can use, the second reason that you can use a secondary source, would be to demonstrate a conversation that's happening outside the text, a conversation that's happening among scholars that you want to enter. So for example, with the Macbeth example that we've been using a number of times, a lot of people interpret Macbeth in psychoanalytical ways. So if a student wanted to talk about a psychoanalytical interpretation of Macbeth where they talk about his guilt or, how he relates to his mother or his father or whatever, which, a lot of people do, or Lady Macbeth in the same way. I might introduce their ideas in order to show you that there is a debate happening about this, and then to tell you what I'm going to say about the debate, how I'm going to enter the debate. Or I might show you someone's idea because I'm going to build on their idea. Like they're saying that he feels guilt in these particular ways, and I want to add to that and take it in another direction that this person hasn't taken it. Or I might use their idea to argue against, as what they call the voice of the opposition. Someone who's going to present an objection or an argument that I'm going to, as the writer, respond to or, break down or show how that's wrong in some way. And all of those are in the neighborhood of alternate interpretations that you're going to represent in order for you to interact with them. And the point there is for the student to interact with those, not just to sort of list, here's what other people have said, but that there's a way in which what they have said connects to the student's claim or argument or interpretation about the text. And you're introducing their ideas in order to show your ideas more clearly and to delineate them from the other people's ideas. So, alternate interpretations versus outside sources. The reason that we ask them to consider other people's interpretations is that that's how, in literary studies and in interpreting literature, interpretations develop and grow through discourse, through dialogue, through having a discussion and a conversation about the text. That if I look at a text and I am analyzing it, I'm going to see it through my perspective, my lens, and that's a good lens. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's a limited lens. It's my lens. It's what I can see, and it's very helpful to understand how other people have seen the same set of information, the same text, the same data, whatever, because they have different lenses. And in understanding how they view it, that will often affect the way that I view it. And sometimes it will change how I view it. Sometimes it will confirm how I view it. It just depends, but it will help me understand the text in a way that's more nuanced and sophisticated. It will help my particular understanding or interpretation of the text to understand how other people have seen it. So I think the most important way to answer that question is students should hear what other people have to say, because that's how you learn what you think about a text, and that's how you understand text in new ways. If we believe, as I do, that knowledge is a discursive practice, it's something that we create together as a community, then that's in essence modeling how that works for students. And this is how knowledge happens: as we come up with ideas, we share them, we get feedback on them, we share them with other people. They either grow beyond us or they die out. And so I think that's why we ask students to look at sources, or we ask students to talk to other students in class about a text. That's why, in the humanities, classes are often discussion-based, because the idea is that this will help you. On another level, in terms of looking at published authors, I guess one of the ideas is that these folks have done a lot of thinking about literature, and they've done a lot of reading, and they have a lot of knowledge, so maybe their lenses are broader and more sophisticated than some of our lenses, so it might be really helpful to hear what they have to say. I don't, however, like to privilege what, folks in the discipline have said just because they're in the discipline or just because they're famous. I guess I'm a little iconoclastic in that way. I don't want students to be like, oh, well, they're so much smarter than me and therefore I have nothing useful to say, because I don't think that helps students either. But it is true that they've thought about it a lot more than the students have, and they probably do have something useful to say, so maybe the student should consider that. So I think for students it's probably hard when you're in literature in particular to walk the line of like, okay, I have to say what I want to say about the text, but I also am aware that I don't know as much as these other folks, so it's maybe a tough position for students to negotiate, but students do have something useful to say.